How's everybody doing? Good? Enjoying the conference so far? All right. Well, prepare to be disappointed. It's all downhill from here. So I've made some mistakes as a software developer. I'm guessing I might be the only one in the room. Maybe? Yeah. Aaron has. Anyway, I've made some mistakes, and my team has made some mistakes. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about those mistakes we've made over the last 2.5 years. But to make sure that I learn my lesson, I've brought a little tool that's going to help me. And Aaron's going to help me use this tool. It's a ruler. And every time I tell you, yep, you got it. I just saw it, so he knows what's going to happen. I want to make sure I don't repeat these mistakes. So every time I show you one of my new mistakes I've made over the last 2 years, I'm going to have Aaron come up here and just whack my hand just to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Are you okay with that, Aaron?
Yeah, of course.
All right. I'm going to start with a quote. This is a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. It's an oldie but a goodie. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly but who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. I'm going to tell you a story starting in 2012 when my team decided to adopt Angular. We considered a variety of different frameworks, and at the time, Angular was definitely the best thing for us. We were coming from a pile of jQuery branded spaghetti that we had in our existing app, and we worked with that to move into a whole Angular app. We replaced about 90% of it. In about 2.5 months, we finished the project. It was pretty fast. The app was relatively small at that point. This was a couple of years ago. Things looked great. For the first time, we had unit tests. We had 50% less HTML and JavaScript than we had under just raw jQuery. We were feeling great. In fact, we felt like geniuses having completed this project. Fast forward over the course of the next 2.5 years, it's now 2015. We have a lot of Angular code. We've made some mistakes over the years, and I want to share with you those mistakes so that you can not repeat them. This is what we look like now. Oh, but I forgot to ask, are there any Homestar Runner fans in the audience? Yeah, another oldie but a goodie? Okay, well, you'll have to go look this guy up later, but that's how we feel like now sometimes after dealing with some of our mistakes. All right, hopefully you can forgive me for my mistakes, and I promise to forgive you. But I'm going to share with you my list, and I know you have your own, and hopefully we can learn and grow together. So here's number 1. Aaron? Oh, jeez.
I got him.
All right. When we first started, we didn't know how to communicate between multiple controllers. So the mechanism we used was inheritance. Here's a scenario. This code has 3 controllers. And of course, as we just learned, scopes by default inherit from their parent scopes when you have a controller nested under another controller. And you can do really stupid things with your scopes when you do that. So here's what we did in our grandchild controller. Oh, forgive me. Let me just... Okay. We had in our main controller, we had a list of things, and in our grandchild controller, we would do things like scope.parent.parent.parent.parent.things.push. And then in the main controller, we had scope.watchThings, right? Yeah, yeah. Not good, right? Why is this so bad? Well, it's bad on its own, but it gets really bad when you insert an NGIf in the middle, because NGIf introduces a new scope. Well, that's easy to fix. Just add a new .parent, right? Problem solved. It is so hard to reason about this code when you stumble across it. That's number 1. Number 2, you have business logic in your controllers. And number 3, how on earth do you grep for your code that's handling those things array? Very difficult. Here's what we should have done. We should have created a shared data service that's responsible for interacting with our API. Controllers can call into that service. Obviously, this is much more direct, it's clear, and you centralize any business logic into services, not in controllers. Controllers are responsible for updating your view and nothing more. If you limit their responsibility there, you'll be happier. All right, number 2, Aaron. Global controller functions. So in the early days of the Angular documentation, this is what you saw, right? This has changed, but here's why it's bad. It's very easy to have naming collisions, 2 functions, one silently overwrites and replaces the other. You can't package controllers into Angular modules, which makes them hard to test. It encourages a concept that I call glof and glog. Glof stands for giant list of files, and glog stands for giant list of files, which I'll show you some more examples of those later. Also, in Angular 1.3, you can't even do this by default. It will not let you register global functions unless you turn it on. Here's what we should have done instead. Declare a module, add a controller to that module. Very simple and obvious, and I'm sure most of you do that. Since we started, the Angular documentation has been updated to show this as the pattern, so I'm very glad. But what we really should have done, and I'll talk about this later, is probably shouldn't have been using NGInclude at all. And I'll talk about that later. If you want to read this link, I just realized whose page this is. Perfect timing. Very good. Okay, number 3. Shadowing. All right, scope shadowing. So here's a case where we have a controller. It's got a property called favorite food. I think we all know what that is. And a little input box inside the HTML that's bound to favorite food. So far, so good, right? Then somebody comes along and inserts a div with an ngIf directive on it. And suddenly what happens? Scope shadowing. Here's why this is bad. You will introduce bugs in your code by simply looking at it. It's very subtle when this happens, right? Sometimes you don't even notice. Unit tests, helpless. We cried a lot of Angular tears. We looked like this. This one caused many, many tears. So let's see why this happens. First of all, as we just learned a couple talks ago, every scope object, depending on your directive, the parent property of that scope is actually the scope's inherited parent, prototypal inheritance. So that's just a true statement. So when I have some markup that looks like this, I actually have 2 scopes. One for the ng controller, and another one for the ngIf. If I draw these graphically, they might look like this. The ngIf scope inherits from the controller scope. If I have some JavaScript that initializes the myController controller and puts 2 properties on it, one called favorite food and one called some variable, then I can expect after this runs, I can expect the scopes to look like this. The controller scope has those 2 properties in it, and the ngIf scope has no interesting properties. But then, when a user types some text into that input box, what happens? This happens. Favorite food gets shadowed on the ngIf controller. This can be very confusing to your code in your controller because it won't see that. It doesn't actually know about that other favorite food property, right? It's on a child controller, or a child scope. So, what we should have done at the time, this didn't exist, but what we should have done is used the so-called controller as syntax. I've been really happy to see today that most of the examples, if not all of them, actually use this syntax, which is great. So the way this works is instead of using the $scope injected name in your controller, you use this. And this then becomes the scope and contains, well, not actually the scope, but you put values on this, and then in your markup, you name it like that, and you reference all of your variables on that name instead of directly. Okay? This eliminates scope shadowing. Now, it wasn't until recently that it dawned on me why this eliminates scope shadowing. I was just happy to have a solution, so we started doing this for our controllers. But I think it's worth it to show, first of all, an alternative, and secondly, how this works under the hood. So if you can't do controller as for whatever reason, you can also do this. It requires a little bit more discipline, but you can say scope.vm inside of your controller and put your properties in there instead of on the scope directly. By the way, VM, in case you're wondering, is a convention. It just stands for view model, and it's just a convention that we use on our team, and I've seen other teams do it. There's nothing special about the name VM. Okay? Other than that, it looks the same. You prefix all of your variables that are bound from your scope with that name, and you're good to go. So, why does this fix it? See if I can do that. Let's go back to our example. So here we have a controller as situation. You can see our two scopes. We have our same initialization code, but it uses this instead of putting it directly on the scope. And just like before, when it populates the controller scope, it fills in those values. But this time, Angular adds a VM property, because that's what we told it to call it, on the scope. Instead of putting the variables directly on the scope, it puts them under that VM object. You can see this if you open your inspector and you have the Batarang extension installed, and you highlight on that element in Chrome. You can type $scope, and you can see your scope actually has a VM property. But now, when a user types something into that variable, it is no longer a one-step assignment. There are now two steps, because Angular has to locate this value first inside the scope, and second, it needs to write the user's input into that value. So what that looks like is this. First, since we're using prototype inheritance, JavaScript searches for scope.vm. And the way that all JavaScript variable reads work on prototypally inherited values is by looking at the child first, and if it's not found, it follows the prototype chain to the next prototype, and so on until it finds the value or hits undefined. In this case, the first thing it tries to find the name VM on is the scope on the NGIf. Here. It's not there. So remember, this is a read. We're looking for the VM object. It goes up the prototype chain, and this time it finds it on the controller scope. That's step one. Then it writes it into that variable. Okay? So let me show you this with a different visual. In other words, when I am writing vm.favoritefood, there are two steps. First of all, they type herring. Secondly, we do this assignment. But I can break that out into these two steps, effectively getting a temp variable on scope.vm, which is a read, and then assigning temp.favoritefood equals herring. That is why the controller as syntax fixes this common bug. Okay? All right. Oh, yep, there you go. All right, Aaron. We used scope. Man, you're really not giving it to me like I need in order to make this memorable. Yeah, you need to step it up a little.
There's a metal edge right here.
That's plastic. I got it approved by the doctor before I brought it in. Yeah. Okay, so using scope.watch has caused us a lot of problems, specifically when we use it to try to capture user events, user input events. When the user interacts with the UI in the browser, we need to know about it in most cases. But using scope.watch to do this can cause a lot of problems. This is a bit of a long example, so I'll step you through it. Let's say in my controller I do something kind of stupid, and I do an AJAX get to pull some data down from my server. When that data arrives, I store it in scope.employee. And then I also set up a watcher on the employee title property, so that if the user, presumably, types into the title field, then I want to do an HTTP put to replace the title on that employee with the newly typed title. I can use scope.watch to do this. But if I do that, I have to do a whole bunch of little checks. Because as soon as you call scope.watch, Angular is going to call your watch function with the current value of that property in the scope. And in this case, because I'm running this on initialization, that value is going to be undefined, right? So the first thing I have to do is check, well, I have to make sure I don't fire off an AJAX request with undefined in it, right? So I filter that out. But then, what about when this response comes back from Ajax? Well, in that case, what's going to happen is the employee title is going to transition from undefined to a string. And so when the watch function fires, this old title value is going to be undefined, and the new title is going to be defined. So I have to also check to make sure old title is defined. Then, in those cases, maybe I'm safe to do an Ajax put with the new title in it, right? But what we found is that doing this pattern became really hard to track the state changes that you care about from the user and the state changes you don't care about because something else happened. Like maybe the value was programmatically updated from another part of the app that already did the put. What we found also is that users would navigate to certain pages, and we would just start kicking off put requests on page navigation to make changes that didn't actually make any changes, like change the employee's title from X to X. And we would do that a lot. And so you would see in your Chrome Network Inspector a get for a page, and then you'd see put, right afterwards. Really bad. It's very difficult in a watch function to differentiate between an action that was initiated from the user and an action that was initiated from another part of your application. And it can lead to duplicate put requests, which obviously are bad for performance and just embarrassing. So what we should have done is, there are three different things. The first one is NGChange, which is specifically designed to capture user events as opposed to scope events or scope changes. Or we could have just used events like emit and broadcast so that we can be notified explicitly for when things change that we care about. And the third thing is this new pattern that came out of Facebook called Flux, which says that data flow should be unidirectional. And user action should always result in an event that gets emitted upward, and then that goes off to dispatchers that ultimately turns into a data store, and the data store should then populate data in your components into this circular pattern that they call Flux, which seems to be a pretty good pattern for that. It is simpler, and when I say the word simple, I mean that in the rigorous form that's defined by Rich Hickey in this talk, which I highly recommend everyone go take a look at, where he talks about not complecting concepts, which in the case that we were using, we were complecting the concept of programmatic change and user input to be a single change event, which caused that problem. All right, next, NGInclude. Better. Better. I hope not. I hope so. All right. So NGInclude. NGInclude, I believe today I consider an anti-pattern. And I know I'm not alone. So here's an example. I've got a controller, and in the middle of that controller, I just include another partial. The partial in this case looks like this. It's got a foo template variable that it displays, and that's that. Looks pretty harmless, but it really isn't. Here's the reason it's bad. The first thing I noticed with NGInclude is that it is slow. I don't know why it's slow. I didn't do much investigation other than once I determined it was slow, I pretty much stopped using it. And by slow, I mean as compared to doing either a server-side include or some other means for populating your partials into your page. The second reason it's bad, and this is probably the more important reason for most people, is that it is very hard to determine context. When I'm reading the code of an NG-included partial, I can't tell about the enclosing context or scopes. It's not indicated in the file. I have to just go searching for variable names, trying to find where these variables came from. Secondly, NGInclude introduces new scope, which of course can be problematic, as we saw before. And lastly, it does not have a rigorous interface for callers. Any caller can just include an NGInclude partial, and there's no one to say they've done it wrong, or that they haven't provided the necessary scope parameters for that include to be valid. So what we should have done instead is used element directives in almost all of these cases. Anytime you want to do an include, you probably really want a directive instead, and you probably want an element directive. Igor made a great comment on Twitter where he said that basically if we had easy to use good components in Angular, we probably wouldn't need NGInclude at all, and I agree with him. Components are the future of Angular. If you listen to some of the talks at NG Europe in October, the message I took away was that components are basically the only thing surviving to Angular 2, right? Everything else is either being changed radically, well, including those, or being dropped completely, including NGInclude and NGController, I'm pretty sure are going to be gone. Here we go. Passing scope to a service. All right. So you can hear it like zing a little. It's good. Yeah, that's going into my memory. It's good. So here we have a controller that injects a service that I've called my service. And what are we doing with it? We're just handing it a scope, right? And then that's really powerful, right? Now, inside that service, I can use scope watchers and all the other cool things that scopes can do. This is bad because you have now leaked your view model abstraction into a service that's supposed to be responsible for your application's business logic. This is really bad because now you've coupled the very top of your application, your view, with the very bottom of your application, your service layer. Services should not have that kind of knowledge. It makes them hard to test, it makes them violate the single responsibility principle, and it makes them want to do naughty things like scope.watch. What we should have done instead is pass values to services, not scopes. Services, you can just as well pass callbacks to services or have them return promises, any kind of different notification system. You don't need to use scopes inside of services. Scopes only have one job, and that is to communicate with your template, your view, from JavaScript. They provide a nice, clean interface so that you can do that and still have it be unit testable and not have any DOM manipulation logic in your controllers. And that's what they're for and nothing else. So if we limit their scope, things will be better. All right.
Really? All right, this is going to be a bad one.
Okay. All right. Homegrown build tools. So at the time we got started, back in 2012, there weren't really a lot of options. And I can tell you from experience that the cat command is not really a good way to concatenate your JavaScript. The other thing we did wrong is we have our backend is written in Python. It's a Django app that serves up all of our front-end HTML and JavaScript and stuff. And in that Python code, we configured these glofs, these giant lists of files, where you have just JS file, JS file, JS file, and so on and so on. Some of these are into the hundreds now, where we say, okay, combine all of these into one application, whoops, and give that up, and we called that a script set. But then we were like, well, wait a minute, sometimes we have applications that are composed of pieces of other applications. Well, let's make glofs for them, and then we'll make glogs to pull them all together. And you end up with quite a mess to figure out what depends on what. And we don't have just one application, we have like 10 applications, but we have one code base. And rather than do a nice automatic dependency management system, we just have, glofs everywhere. This has been pretty bad. Your app can break, and it does break because some developer will be working on application A, and they'll add a new dependency, add the file to the glof, everything's good. And then 2 weeks later, someone goes to run application B, and it just breaks with a console error on load because it's missing a file, and therefore doesn't have some dependency met. It's very hard if you do this. Oh, time's up. Don't slap me. All right. Way over time. Bam. Okay, sorry. So what we should have done is use tools from 2015 and 2012, namely Webpack, and then we would have been in really much better shape. So last of all, NGController. We probably should have never used NGController, and that's starting to become a really popular mantra too. So what I wanted to ask is for you to share with everyone what mistakes you have made so we can all learn from each other. And if you'll post them on Twitter, #NGOops, and we can all learn and grow together. Thanks very much.